Hello everyone. Welcome to this video on how to develop a research question. My name is Eric Christensen. In this video, we're going to review why it's important to have a research question, how to narrow down your research question, and how to rewrite your research question so it's more specific. So the first question you might be asking yourself is, why do I need a research question in the first place? Well, there's a few reasons for this. The first reason is that having a research question helps us more clearly focus our research project in general. So it's a lot more specific if we can frame what we're looking for as a question, because it gives us some direction of the kind of resources we might need to answer that question. The second reason is that questions help us reduce our own biases. It's a lot easier to write on a topic or write about what we already believe. But if we have a question, we have to answer that question, and we have to base that question off the evidence that we find, not our opinion. So the first step is that we want to start with a broad question. In this example, I've asked something super broad. I'm asking, what is the recovery rate for ankle injuries? Now, when you start with your broad question, don't worry about the specifics. Just try to get something down. As soon as you write down a broader question, you may even start asking yourself some other questions that might help you narrow your broader question down. Ankle injuries are pretty specific, so that's a good place to start. We may want to ask ourselves if recovery rate is what we want to ask. What does recovery rate mean? You can kind of pick apart your question piece by piece, and then that'll help you narrow it. The second step is to narrow our research question. And there's really 4 ways that you'll want to do that. The first way to narrow your research question is by time. So when did this particular topic or question take place? A time frame, a year, a date range is really helpful. So that's option number 1. The second option is to limit your question by location. So that could be a geographic location like a country or a continent, and that kind of works in tandem with time. The third way to narrow your question is by category. So in our first broader question, we were talking about injuries, and we kind of specified this even further to ankle injuries. And the fourth way to narrow down your question is by the issue at hand. Let's try to apply this to our existing research question to see if we can narrow it down even further. This particular question isn't completely broad. The issue that we're really dealing with here are ankle injuries, which kind of works for our issue. However, related to ankle injuries, we might want to narrow down a population. For instance, we might want to narrow our population by the activity, so that could be sport, or some sort of other population group. We probably also want to limit this to a location. We could say Canada, or perhaps the United States. We could say Europe, or we could even say limit this to a particular subgroup. The other one is time. We could limit this research question to, say, a particular period, like the last 20 years. A good rule of thumb might be to keep the time fairly broad when you start doing your research. This is because at this point we're not really sure what the existing research is, and we don't want to get 0 results. Another thing to keep in mind is that time may be related to the particular subpopulation, population group, or category that we choose. Based on these 4 categories, I've narrowed down my question in a few ways. For instance, I've narrowed this down to a sport that I'm particularly interested in this case, basketball players. And I've also limited the geography to the United States and Canada. Like I said earlier, I've left time out for the time being, but I could always include a time period later in my second revision of the question. Here are some next steps. First, I want you to try writing your own research question. The first part of this step is to start broad, so you don't have to have a narrow research question right away. Second, you should narrow your research question based on time, location, category, and issue, where relevant. And three, try to develop some keywords based on your revision or narrow research question. You can use these keywords to look for sources through the library. Try writing your own research question now. When you've done that, return to this video. Doing some preliminary searching revealed some problems with my research question, which is why I wanted to return to it. To recap, my revised question is, what is the ankle injury recovery rate for basketball players in Canada and the United States? The first issue is that injury recovery rate is fairly easy to answer. Some of the resources just gave me a plain percentage. We want to avoid questions that give us yes or no answers because that's too simple to write an essay around. The second problem is that Canada and the United States is too broad in terms of my population. A better way to go would be to choose a particular sport and perhaps a division in that sport. For my second question revision, I've made this a lot more specific. For instance, rather than looking at ankle injury recovery rates, I'm looking at the treatments that are most effective for treating ankle injuries to begin with. I've also changed this so my population group is a lot more specific. Rather than Canada and the United States, I want to search now for basketball players in the NBA specifically, so that's much more narrow. As you move forward in your research, there's a few things you'll want to keep in mind. The first is that you'll want to revise your question based on the research you find through the library. Aligning your question with the available research will result in a much better paper or thesis. Also, it's not uncommon to revise your question 4 or 5 times. The best advice I can give you is to keep at it. This has been a brief overview of how to create and revise a research question.